But a lot of times they would just give someone a bus ticket and hope they make it to the other location. And so it's nice to be able to be helpful. And not only to give them a ride, but to elevate it. Like, you know what? You're going to be treated like a queen today.
How many people go through life doing work they really don't like, but every day dreaming of, say, working in the aviation industry? They say it's too late. They think it would be too hard. They think it would go against conventional norms. If you never go after what you want, you'll never have it. This is Fly the Transition. Join us as we soar through the captivating stories of individuals embracing a thrilling journey into the aviation industry. From pilots spreading their wings to mechanics fine-tuning the engines and a myriad of industry professionals, each with a unique tale to tell. Get ready to dive into the diverse backgrounds, the pivotal moments that propelled their leap, and the sheer determination that transformed their aspirations into reality. We're not just about dreams. We're about making them take flight. Welcome to Fly the Transition. And now your host, Jim Schilling.
Welcome back, all my aviation friends, for another episode of Fly the Transition, where we will explore yet another journey of aviation career transformation. I'm your host, Jim, and I am really excited to bring you this episode because not only will we hear a story of someone who joined the aviation industry a little bit later in life, but she's also one of the founders of the Freedom Aviation Network, whose mission is to support the survivors of human trafficking through transporting them to various places throughout the country with assistance of advocacy. So I'll be having co-founder and operations officer of Freedom Aviation Network, Stephanie Lamar, joining me in just a few minutes. So as I hinted at last episode, I was getting ready to take one of the written tests for my flight instructor rating, the Fundamentals of Instruction exam. I felt really good about my preparation, and I felt good about my grasp of the material, and I was really ready when I took that test. So the results of the test is I passed with a score in the high 90s. I feel fantastic about the results of that exam. And to celebrate, I then came home and immediately started studying for the next exam for the actual knowledge portion for the CFI rating. I'm not going to set a deadline on when I'd like to be done with that studying and the exam itself. I just want to make sure that I feel comfortable with the material before I schedule that test. So more news to follow on that as I continue working towards my CFI rating ever so slowly. So before we get into the interview itself, just a couple quick calls to action for you folks. If you're liking what I'm doing, I would really appreciate if you shared this far and wide, not just the stories of aviation career transformation, but with this episode specifically because it's such a compelling message, and looking for ways to volunteer as a pilot are out there, and there's some that get a little bit more attention than others. So if this is something that resonates with you, please, I encourage you to share this with others to get the word out about organizations like Freedom Aviation. Another way to get the podcast some exposure is to leave a rating and review wherever you're listening to this episode. If you want to pause it and scroll to that place on your podcast player, I'll wait. I'll be here as soon as you come back. And then just leave that 5-star rating and then leave a review. I will read reviews on a future episode, so a little incentive there to leave your mark on the Fly the Transition podcast. All right, so on to this episode of Fly the Transition. We'll be talking with Stephanie Lamar, who is, again, the operations officer and co-founder of Freedom Aviation Network. We'll hear about how she got some early exposure as a child to aviation and didn't really understand that that was a career option that she could follow. Like many before her, they've believed that the military was the route to go. That wasn't necessarily for her, and she also didn't really see a lot of women in aviation. So she would ultimately get her private pilot's license and would later pause when she had children and then take a 15-year break from aviation altogether to work on raising a family, which is admirable in and of itself. She'll talk to us a bit about how she got that spark reignited for aviation, started working on ratings again, and thought she would cap at flight instructor, but ultimately found a route to a regional airlines where she is now a first officer. And if that's not enough, in 2020, she also started flying as a volunteer pilot for a program called Rescue One Global, which has now grown into what is today Freedom Aviation Network. She'll tell us all about how Freedom Aviation Network came to be, what their mission is, and how you could fly as a volunteer pilot if this is something that resonates with you as well. So without further ado, today's interview with Stephanie Lamar with Freedom Aviation Network. Well, Stephanie, welcome to the Fly the Transition podcast. I'm so excited that you're able to take the time to sit down and chat with me. You are part of a very worthy cause, and I can't wait to get into that.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show, and I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's start off with, how did you first initially get exposed to aviation? Was it something you grew up with, something in your teens or later, or something else?
Yeah, so my initial exposure was I was on a little baseball team when I was 9, and the sponsor was the sheriff of the town, who was a pilot. So on our last game, he came and took all of us girls flying. And that was it for me. I absolutely loved it. And so, this was, I won't say quite how old I am, but, early 80s or whatever. And, I'm not so sure everything was done by the book, because I remember him coming to get us in a field. I don't believe there was an airport nearby, so that was interesting. But we all kind of climbed in the back, and, but I loved it. I absolutely loved it from the moment we took off, everything about it. And so I wanted to become a pilot after that. And so, I really feel like EAA and all those programs where you take someone and exposure, because so much aviation, you might have only gotten exposure to it if you had a family member or something. Sure. You're kind of exclusive in some of those ways. So I'm very appreciative for him for taking us.
So after that kind of initial exposure at like 9 years old, are there other steps that end up coming into play, like in your teen years, to advance aviation?
No other opportunity.
Okay.
I remember in high school, I went to a small high school in a rural area. I remember asking about flight training. How do I become a pilot? And of course, this is before the internet or anything. Everyone just kept telling me, well, you have to go to the military.
Right.
You need to go to the military. And I am not a military type of person. I'm not going to say anything bad about that, but I just didn't think I'd make it through basic training. Someone yell at me, I'm going to cry, I'm done. So I just this is not going to work. I don't think I could do military. And so I just went to college like people do. I didn't have any clue how to get in it. And from people keeping telling me that, I just assumed it was a no. You can't do this unless you go this route. Yeah.
That was pretty common back then, as far as like people just having that mentality of like, well, if you're not a military pilot, it's not going to happen.
And nobody knew. I don't think anyone really knew. They just assume, well, you have to get all these hours and this is how it's done. That's how people do it. And maybe they didn't really know. And so I just accepted that and went on. And so I went to college. I ended up studying science and things like that. My first job was in a neuroscience research facility. Okay. And I saw the opportunity to take a ground school class through community education for, it was just pilot ground school. And I'm like, I can't afford to go flying. I just assumed I couldn't afford it. But I could learn about it. So that was my first opportunity. And I just signed up for the class. I remember being late to every class because from where I had to drive from and through the traffic to get there, I was always late. I had to walk through a welding class to get to this shady little classroom in the back of, some hangar somewhere. And it was about 30 men and me. Some, 21-year-old girls sitting in the back of this class. And I loved it. And it was, every week we took a test and they're like, well, at the end of this, if you're doing well enough, I'll sign you off to take this ground school test. Okay. At this point, I don't know anything about how to get through this, if I'm even there for a private. I just wanted to learn about it. And I remember we're studying the instruments. And he's like, it'd really help you guys if you just went on one flight, even just one flight, and you would understand how the instruments work. I'm like, well, all right, I'll pay for one flight, and it was expensive. I wasn't making that much money and it just seemed pricey. And I know back then it was like $100 an hour, but still seemed very expensive. And I took that one lesson. And this is hilarious, this poor guy. I mean, he was probably doing his CFI thing for a while, kind of bored with it, and it was at Pontiac Airport, very busy little airport. I'm barely getting on the taxiing. You know how people do. You're practically running in the grass trying to steer at the yoke. And
The drunken taxiing. Yes, I've experienced that myself.
sweet. I'm like, like, why are we still going over here? And I'm turning the yoke and it's not working. And then he's like telling me, all right, so at like 55, you're just going to pull back on the yoke. We're going to be fine. I'm like, why is he even letting me do this? This doesn't seem right. Okay. And we get in the air and I just started screaming, literally screaming. And he's probably like, this idiot woman. What did she think we were going to do? I don't know, but it was amazing. I loved every minute of it. And then it was like, how am I going to pay to do this?
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of it. And I just scraped together every penny, got it together. I ended up moving about halfway through. So I got into like the cross country portion. I soloed, I did all that stuff. And then I moved to Tennessee. So that kind of delayed things a little bit. But my husband was very encouraging that they finish this. No, you got to finish. And I was going to grad school and I'm like, it feels like a lot to pay for. I need to get on with things. And, I was going into the educational field and wanting to be a teacher. And it just felt like it's too much money. And at that time, I still didn't see a career in it. Like, I'll never get enough hours. No one is encouraging me. I was the only woman I'd ever seen. I never saw any other females around there. And nobody ever asked, well, do you want to go take this farther? You should do this. You should become a commercial pilot. No one mentioned anything of how you do this. And I find it kind of funny because a lot of times the women never get that, or a guy is going to come in and be like, all right, you need to take these steps or you need to do this. It's not the same with a woman in that sphere. So it's just a little more difficult to get through some of those things. And, I did my private pilot and I wanted to keep flying. At this point, I'm a teacher. I'm working at the school. I'm making money. My husband didn't seem to want much of my money. So I'm like, what do I do with it? Go buy an aircraft, of course. That sort of worked out. And then I bought it and it was 1 month before 9/11.
Okay.
So bought the plane and then couldn't fly it for months and went through all that turmoil and all that stuff that many people remember going on. And so, but I did end up earning the instrument rating.
Okay.
And finally had someone, and I could tell you some stories about that. Those guys were terrible. And I remember going in wanting to do my instrument rating in a couple of weeks. I had people to fly with at other times. So I'm like, I just want to do my minimum with the instructor. I don't want to pay and pay and pay.
Oh,
let's just get through this and I will practice with someone else. And I was told, well, you'd have to be really smart to do that. And I was so upset. No. So I went in and I got 100% of my instrument written before Shepherd Air, before any of that. And the guys in the office, they're like, oh, she didn't get it. Oh, no way. Nobody gets 100%. I walked in and I said, you must have to be really smart to do that.
good for you.
Just tired of those boys. But that's what it is when you're a woman. You can't seem to get ahead with that. You're not taken seriously. So, my instructor finally encouraged me. It's like, well, you should go on and get your commercial. You can do this. And I don't know, the plane wasn't doing well because of September 11th, and it wasn't going to keep paying for itself. And then I got pregnant with my son. And it was like, I can't pay to have this airplane and have kids. So I just kind of let it go because I didn't really see a career in it. And then September 11th, when that happened, the airlines weren't hiring. Nothing was going on that way. So, I took that break. I stayed home. I had 3 boys and raised my kids. And I just kind of turned my back on it for a long time.
Well, there's no shame in that. And changing your priorities in your life as you progress through it,
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to. You have kids, and that just takes up your world. And they're not cheap.
No,
there's no money for flying when you're paying for kids and all that stuff. And I didn't mind it. My interests were somewhere else now. And, and I really didn't see myself coming back to it, and that was 15 years before I get in a plane again.
Well, I think it's interesting too that like you're progressing through those things, but you don't necessarily have that same support system or even the places you can research this stuff or organizations that are as readily available as they are now. So
there just wasn't much. I mean, no one was serious about a woman in aviation. Most of the time when I flew my plane, most people didn't think I was a pilot. If I walked into an FBO, they'd be asking my husband all these questions. Oh, do you need fuel? Do you need this? And he'd be like, well, you need to ask her. Like, why? Right? Like, oh. And even if they find out you're the pilot, they would still talk to my husband. So it's like, that doesn't make any sense. But let him kind of out why, it is what it is.
And you can probably speak way better to this than I can, but I think that there's been some progress made. But even like in 2024, like my partner in my plane is a female. She has been my flight instructor since the beginning. She's phenomenal, very skilled pilot. But even I've seen with her, as we're at different places, if you get in the right company of certain generations of pilots, it still very much exists. Where they, like, she was asked that. She was she's the wife of a pilot. And we're like, no, she is the pilot. Like, and she's really good.
You get that a lot, especially even with students. I would take students places and they always assume the student who could fly the plane was the pilot and I was just his passenger. And that's just typical. But, it's just there and it's just an undercurrent. I remember being a CFI at the local flight school. And even when people don't mean it, this is the kind of thing that happens. So all the guys are there with their girlfriends and I'm there with my husband. And the comment to all the women was, well, do you fly with him? Do you go up in the air with him? Do you go, are you brave enough to go out with him? To my husband, they asked, are you going to take flight lessons? Are you going to learn to fly?
Interesting.
And not necessarily even meaning that, but
yeah,
it just kept happening over and over. And I was like, that's really interesting. They weren't trying to be sexist. No one's trying to say that, but it does still exist, I got off a plane recently. I was going to go do the walk around on my jet and this little girl. And I thought, wow, already so young. She was about 10 years old. And she's like, is the pilot going to get off? I was like, do you mean the captain? Or I was just confused for a minute. I'm like, I am the pilot. She's like, do you know how to fly the plane? I'm like, I just flew you here.
How do you think you got here?
But already at 9 or 10, she's already like, you're a woman. So obviously that wasn't you. I don't know. Same uniform. It's just interesting, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. So as we're in this kind of 15-year break, I mean, you just turn your back on aviation altogether. There's no flying. I assume your plane has been sold so that you can, focus on family.
Sold. Yeah, I'm just doing the kid stuff and raising a family. 3 boys kept me busy enough, so I didn't really have time to think about it. All my aviation stuff was in the attic. It's just done. I don't come back into it until I went on a vacation with a girlfriend who she was a pilot, and we went to England. And we looked up some 99 members and went and had dinner with them at one of these, I guess it's like their Air Force club. I did this in Europe. I forget what it was called. But kind of exclusive, so that some of the other 99s wanted to go. And so we had dinner, and this woman named Jennifer Murray invited us to go fly in her helicopter. And I didn't know who she was from Adam. She seemed, like, sure, we'll go fly your helicopter, right? And so she lived in London. She took us up in the helicopter, has her name on it. I mean, she's as cute as she can be. We get to her house, though, and she gives us her book. I'm like, who is she? Look. Yeah. So apparently, unbeknownst to us, she was the first person to fly around the world in a helicopter.
No kidding.
The first person to go to the North and South Pole in a helicopter. I'm like, well, darn. And she didn't start flying until she was 50. And I was looking at that time I was 46. And I'm like, well, she's out here breaking records and she's doing all this stuff. And we end up flying to her house. And, it was just an unreal experience. I mean, this just not knowing who you're with. And, her husband was like on the cover of Time magazine, which we saw in her house. And we're like, who are these people? Yeah. You just think you're going for a helicopter ride with whoever. But she was very inspiring to me. And when I got home, I was like, well, you know what? Maybe I could become a CFI. I mean, I was a teacher. I raised my kids. I love to fly. So maybe I could put the two together. But I didn't know how many hours I had. I knew I wrote them all in my logbook. But I don't know. The number didn't stick with me. And I asked my husband to get my logbook from the attic, this old logbook. And I'm like, I have to be close because I knew you needed 250 hours to be a commercial pilot. I was Googling that. And I'm like, all right, I have to be somewhere in the ballpark because I don't have money to make this go on and on. And when I looked through my logbook, I had 232 hours.
Nice.
And I was like,
That's pretty
close
good.
enough. Yeah, I'm close enough. Let's go do this thing. And a couple months later, my husband had gotten me a flight simulator. Okay. And within 2 months, I was ready for the commercial.
Nice.
And a couple months after that, I was ready for the CFI and started teaching.
Good for you. And you did it way quicker than I have, so.
Well, that simulator helped. Let me tell you, the hardest part was the radio calls. So at home, I could fly the simulator. My boys were watching me do this because this was, 2019. So that would have been almost 5 years ago now. And so they were all kind of teenagers, all still in the house. So they're watching me practice on this plane, the simulator. I remember the first time I got it out, I was real upset because I couldn't see the runway. You got to turn your head. Yeah. I didn't know how to do that. And my youngest was like, oh, Mom, you're just not a gamer. And he comes over, hits a couple buttons. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, well, I'm used to a real plane. I can look out the window. I'm flying down this thing. And I learned how to use it and really get my skills down, but there's no radio. And so I get out there and go, how do we do all these radio calls again? But, it all came together. And that was it. I became a CFI, and the flight school has taken lessons, hired me on, and
okay.
It just went from there.
So was it that experience that kind of resonated with you to push you back towards aviation?
She was just an inspiring woman because, to hear her say, I didn't start this till I was 50, and the only reason she took up helicopter flying was because her husband, big businessman, needed to get from the country house into the city, and he didn't want to have to drive, and, he's, important, so he had to get there. And they didn't want to pay for this helicopter. He was like, you need to go learn to fly it because I don't have time. And she did. And not only did she do that, and she had her kids at the time, but she was doing all this other stuff. And so I was just like, my kids are teenagers. They don't need me like they used to. I need to do something for me. And so, I need to have something to do when they're gone out of the house, And so it was kind of neat for them to watch me and to see me pass these tests and these things. And they were just very proud of me and to be able to take them flying. And so it was great.
Before we continue with this episode, a quick word from those who help make the Fly the Transition podcast possible. Are you tired of uncomfortable sunglasses in the cockpit? Well, check out Flying Eyes Optics, designed by pilots for pilots. These ultra-lightweight, durable frames fit perfectly under your headset without that painful pressure you experience with cheaper sunglasses. Don't let discomfort distract you from the joy of flying. Visit our affiliate link and use affiliate code FlyingMidwest10 and you will save 10% off your next pair while helping to support the podcast. Elevate your flying experience with Flying Eyes. Thinking of upgrading your headset? Well, Lightspeed Aviation headsets are perfect for transitioning pilots and those in training alike, combining crystal clear audio with industry-leading noise cancellation. Whether you're just starting training or you're already in that full transition to aviation, a Lightspeed headset will give you that edge. Visit our affiliate link down in the show notes, and you too can explore your next go-to headset. Do you love the podcast? Now you can represent it wherever you go. Check out our Fly the Transition merch store for exclusive designs, including t-shirts, hats, and more, all crafted for the aviation enthusiasts. Get your gear and show the world that you're following your aviation dreams. Head on over to flyingmidwest.com/merch and start repping Fly the Transition today.
You're listening to Fly the Transition. If you've ever thought about changing careers and getting into the aviation industry, welcome to your new home. Now, back to your host, Jim Schilling.
So talk to me a bit about what you envisioned as your goal for where you go with aviation. I know that you went and got your commercial rating and your CFI rating, but was that the finish line that you intended when you got back into flying?
Yes. Actually, that was the top. That was the end goal. Okay. Yeah. I thought, well, this way people pay for my flying. It'll be fun. That was it. And part of that was an old mentality. They never used to hire pilots for the airlines if you were past the age of 35.
Okay, yeah.
That has since changed, but I didn't really know. But being 46 when I started, by the time I was applying to the airlines, I'm 48, 49. I'm like, why would they hire me to train me? You're not going to get that much out of me. And so I didn't think that airlines would hire me anyway. It wasn't until some of my friends that I was working with as a CFI went to the airlines, and one of them's like, "Oh, Stephanie, there was a 60-year-old in my class." I'm like, "No way." And, being older, I don't want to say anything about other old people, but you slow down a little bit. You're not as quick. You can't learn quite, you're just not as sharp. And I'm like, I don't know. Can I get into a jet? And am I going to be fast enough and quick enough to learn all this new material? I wasn't sure. So the nice thing about being old is it's like, if this fails, oh, well, I gave it a try, right? And so I applied and I was accepted at a couple of airlines and just went where whoever wanted me first. I'm like, all right, let me go. And that was GoJet. And I went to training and, I was in there with 3 other young men, and it's like, that's okay. 2 of them were quite gifted. One ended up dropping out. But the one who became my sim partners was from Nashville. Young man. He was an Osprey mechanic, so he's just brilliant. But, he could help me study all the systems and all that stuff and really help me through the sims, because I will tell you, as an older person, you do sims for 4 hours. After 2 hours, I was spent. I was like, I'm exhausted. This is just too much. And now you have to do another 2 hours. So whatever I did second really sucked. Whether it was the pilot monitoring or the pilot flying, it just didn't matter. So it's like the first 2 hours were good. And then it was like, I just can't do this anymore. It's just too much. But I got through it. The nice thing about GoJet was there was a woman in the class in front of me, a few sims ahead, and they offered her additional sims. Okay. And that just encouraged me. It's like, just keep going. Because if you fail, it counts as a failure, but if you quit, it counts as a failure. And in my mind, it was like, well, I've gone to GoJet, and if I fail out, I still had, Endeavor. I could go there later. And I thought, this will help, right? But, they were offering more sims. They're being encouraging. I didn't end up needing them, but it was just a nice thing to know.
It's like, knowing that it's there.
Right. Like, it's not just done. Oh, you sucked. You didn't make it. You're done. But as long as you kept trying, you had a good attitude, they were willing to work with you. And so, the day before my check ride, I did the flying first, thank God. And that went well enough that they're like, all right, you can go take this check ride. And it was all fine. And when I was done, they're like, you deserve this. You earned that. You did a great job. And so that felt good. And then you go learn to fly the rail jet, which they all say to you, okay, now go learn to fly the plane. That is an interesting experience, because the first time you fly that plane, you have all the passengers back there.
Yeah. It's
like, okay, I hope this is something like the simulator, because, I had the home sim and it was not exactly like the plane. And so I was really worried, am I going to be able to land this? Is it going to be smooth? But it was all right.
You mentioned very early on, you talked about, places like EAA, and you've mentioned the 99s. As you were working through your commercial, your CFI, and even towards the airlines, were those good resources for you through those steps, or did that come later?
I'd say my CFI was my best help. So I ended up with a female CFI, and I think that was very encouraging for me, because my first CFI had, coming into the commercial, I basically had to move on from him. And I'm going to say I was a difficult student. You take someone who hasn't flown in 15 years, and they're going for a commercial rating. There are things I forgot, but you don't know you forgot them. Like, I don't know about this unless you remind me. I was reading as much as I could, but there's just gaps, and I needed someone to really look at where I was, figure it out. And she was amazing. She's like, no, you can do this. This is, you're doing fine. And she was really very encouraging. And she told me to join Female Aviators Sticking Together. So that's fast. And I did that. You haven't?
No, I've heard of Women Aviation and the 99s. I hadn't heard of that one, though.
Women in Aviation is a great organization as well. They're very encouraging to the professional pilot. Okay. But FAST is more like an online community of female aviators. And you can go on there and talk about, I'm having this trouble in training, or I'm trying to do this. And it's almost like an encouraging group of women. And yet it's very interesting, because you'll hear the same stories over and over from the other women and encouraging women in a different way. I found, and especially for being a CFI, this is just kind of interesting, but men are more, they have that ego, they have that bravado, they're ready to go. No. And so they could fly like crap and they will tell you, yes, I'm ready to solo, I'm ready to go. Very confident. But the ladies could be flying like amazing. Like, women, you are ready to solo and go on and beyond. You're ready for your commercial ticket. And they're like, oh, I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm ready. I made that one little mistake and we need to do all this again. And so I think it's just a different mindset that women have. It's like, I need to be 100 times better before I'm good enough. And so just having that even in my own training, like, am I really ready? Am I really ready to teach someone? And of course, you're doing your CFI training, and maybe you'll get to this. Your CFIs are asking you so many questions like, what is the manifold pressure when the engine is at idle? I'm like, okay. And then you get in the plane with your new private student and they point to the throttle. What is that?
What's that do?
Oh, thank God. And you answer it and they think you're brilliant and you're like, oh, okay, I can do this. But, it's just a different thing. So you just have to build confidence in it. And so those groups did help with me building confidence. I enjoy being part of the women organizations, and I like to encourage the younger women coming up. Whenever I talk to a woman, I always encourage her to get in the cockpit, even our flight attendant, because a lot of times they love the lifestyle, they like the job, and it's like, have you thought about being the pilot? And you'd be surprised how many of them think they can't do it or didn't think of it, or they just don't think of it for themselves. Yeah. And they're never given that encouragement. I remember talking to a father on a flight, he's talking to me about aviation. Oh, my daughter has become a flight attendant. She's so excited. And I looked at him and I said, that's great. I mean, I'm glad she has a great career. Have you talked to her about becoming a pilot? No. And I said, well, if it was his son instead of a daughter, would you have mentioned that? Would you be happy that your son had just become a flight attendant? Or would you encourage him at such a young age to get in the front of the cockpit? Yeah. And it's not that everyone needs to do that. It's just, I feel like we need to encourage because they're not being encouraged. So I think that's really where women in aviation, the 99s, inspiring that younger generation to come up and to do that is just important.
What are the numbers? Like I've just looked at this not that long ago. It's not.
She's percent of pilots are women, which hasn't changed much since I started. And at the level of like where I'm at as a professional pilot, beyond private pilot, it's around 4%. But it's still not high. GoJet is actually seeking female pilots. They're really heavily involved in women in aviation, so we might have a little bit higher percentage than others. But I remember when I went to GoJet, I'd flown with, I'd been on a few flights, and I was flying this one pilot. I'm like, so do we have any female captains? And it's like, oh, yeah, Tanya.
Yeah,
and I just start laughing if you got the one by name. And he's like, well, maybe there's another one. It's like, oh, okay, but at least, okay, there's one, and you know her name. So it's a different thing, but
yeah.
So
the other thing I wanted to go back on was kind of that very initial training you do up until the sim. And you mentioned something as far as, as you get a little bit older, you're not as maybe quick on the uptake with new information, things like that. Is that something that you had to counter as you went through your training, or were there things that you did to compensate for that? Or
I felt like I had to study a lot, but then I think maybe I was doing more than I needed to. I don't know. I'm a perfectionist, so it was like I need to get 100 on the test and all that, But to be fair to myself, I was in class, and the two gentlemen that were in my class, one was an Osprey mechanic, and the other one was an engineer on subsystems.
Oh, wow.
So learning systems was not their problem. So they'd be asking to see the schematic from the mechanic's logbook and trying to figure out how the wiring worked. And that's the depth I was trying to get to because I thought I needed to, because I have no idea what they're going to ask me in my check ride. Sure. So I have these little books they gave us, and then I get to the check ride and they ask me pretty simple stuff, like, what does this button do? And what is like, Oh, okay. That was pretty simple. You don't need me to pull up the electronic schematic and figure out. So I was probably going too far, but I was studying nonstop. And I found that my partners, they were able to work ahead because that was so easy for them.
Okay.
So while I'm sitting there studying systems, they're studying for the sims. And the sims, you have to memorize call outs.
Okay.
So not only do you have to figure out how to fly the plane in all these flows and flight profiles. So you have to fly everything a very specific way in Part 121. You can't just, turn off the autopilot and fly it and land it. You have to do everything very systematically. I have to ask my sim partner to put the flaps in. You can't do that yourself, things like this. And there's this script that goes back and forth. I made recordings of the opposite script. So I could practice in my room with the paper tiger and all that. And so I'd hear myself say the other role. So I would get used to this back and forth. But I was probably working a lot harder on that. But I wasn't working on it ahead of time. So while we're doing Sims, they're working on that. I haven't gotten to that because I'm still working on systems. And so I think I was just a little bit behind where they were, but they were quite gifted. We'll just say I was having a hard time. So when I got to Sims, I would say my partner was doing way better than me, but that was helpful to me though as well, because I've heard stories of people getting in the sim and their partner kind of sucks too, and they're messing you up, because you're expecting your partner to say things, right? Like, positive rate, and then I would say gear up speed mode. Well, if he doesn't say positive rate, then that's my cue, and so you can just get behind together. So at least he was on top of it and keeping me going. Very encouraging, but yeah, I was certainly the slow one in the group. Let's just say that.
Well, I suppose that you're not just learning systems and procedures, you're learning how to operate as a crew too. And I think for a lot of people, that's probably challenging.
Yeah, because I never went to, some of these schools work on that. I know when you go to an ATP type school, they actually spend time once you get your instrument. I think they have you do 2 crew training because you have to do all those hours anyway to get, up to 250. And I think they teach them to fly as a crew a little bit. Okay. And that would have been helpful training, just nothing I'd ever had, the level that you have to follow checklists and read them out and do every step. And you're doing all that, I don't know about you, but when things get difficult for me in an aircraft, I don't start talking. I'm like, shush, I got to concentrate. And so you're concentrating and you're not saying the things you got to be saying. And I don't know how many times I turned off everything, autopilot everything. And then the guy would come up behind me. You can't fly in raw data. 3 sims later, before I knew what raw data was. I'm like, what's he talking about? Raw data? It's all there. It's not like I'm computing it. He meant without a flight director.
Oh, he meant.
I fly without a flight director all the time. I don't know what the problem is. Yeah. But it was sort of encouraging in a weird way is every time I'd come in, I'd land it perfectly. Well, she certainly can land the plane. Well, I think that's a good thing.
Every takeoff requires a landing. So
it really does. So it's like, well, good. I turned it off. I flew on my raw data.
Yeah.
Brought it in for a landing. So I don't know. That was just kind of the funny thing. And then trying to decide if you're following the flight director, because they'd yell at you, follow the flight director, just follow the flight director. Then you'll be following the flight director. Like, don't follow the flight director. It doesn't know where you're going. I'm like, oh my God, just make up your mind. Am I going to follow it? Am I not going to follow it? Let me just. So it's stressful in the sim. It's very stressful. And being older, and for anyone who's older listening, trying to see the buttons, because I wear readers of the now. So when you have to look at the panel that's above you, you're looking above the readers. So you literally have to go, ring your head back to see it. You can't see it. And the whole area is dark. And I can't see everything that's over on my partner's side. And you have to kind of see. So that is it's not that you can't do it. And in the real world, I find it's not as difficult and you memorize where things are. But it added a level. Yeah. Gosh, I'm old. And the kid's next to me. What's wrong with your eyes? Well, it looks fuzzy over there. I'm not quite sure what it says. Yeah.
So you've been flying professionally now for 2 years, is that right? 2.5?
2 years. I'm hitting my 2-year mark at GoJet, and I'm about to do captain upgrade.
Oh, good for you.
So,
Are you?
good Lord.
I was gonna say, are you excited for that, or is that like a apprehensive thing, or?
I'm feeling to it. One, I thought I would go to the next step as an FO.
Okay.
So I wasn't planning to do captain upgrade. You know, everyone was hiring like crazy, and I thought I'd go to like a major Southwest as an FO. So why move up, right? Like just go FO to FO. That was my original plan. And now no one's hiring. I don't know if you know about that, but
Yeah, it's kind of
cool. Drawings aren't coming out. Nobody's hiring. And so it's like, okay, when they do start hiring, they're going to want to see PIC time. So I feel like I'm kind of being pushed into it. But in one way, I didn't really want to do it because at the regional level, as a first officer, I can just drop trips. I can do what I want. I'm pretty high in the seniority for an FO right now that I've been there for 2 years. So whatever I bid for, I get. If I want days off, I get them. And so running Freedom Aviation Network, that's important to me. When I move to the captaincy, yeah, they'll pay me more. That's great, but no more, picking my schedule. There will be no dropping of flying. But, you're going to get called in on days off. So it just becomes more of a harder job in a way, quality of life can go down. And so I'm kind of torn between it. I feel like I need to move on to that step, but at the same time, there's that quality of life issue.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, you had mentioned that you'd like to have that time to work on Freedom Aviation Network, and I think that we should absolutely talk about the programs that you guys have there. So tell me a bit about how Freedom Aviation came to be and just what it's all about.
So we started this. This is interesting. So Jared Miller is my partner in that, and I've known Jared for a long time. He hates it when I say this, but I know him when he was a kid because he was like 17, 18 years old, and he was my son's swim coach. Okay. And so loved him. He did a great job, and he was going to go off to the Peace Corps and save the world, and I followed him on Facebook, and this is all great. And then about 10 years later, he starts flying lessons. And I'm a CFI, and I'm like, what are you doing? We need to talk. I need to make sure you're, everything's good with you. And we have a conversation. He's like, yeah, I'm learning to fly because, I work with this group, Rescue One Global, and I'm their CEO, and I'm trying to figure out how to manage the transportation with this human trafficking that he's working on. I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting. Great. At that time, I worked for a nonprofit, Nashville Peacemakers. And not a week later, I was supposed to meet with the founder of that. And she's like, no, I can't meet with you, Stephanie. We've had this girl go missing. The mom called me. She's up in Ohio. We're going to have to go get her. I don't know what to do. Nobody will help us. I'm like, hold on. I know someone who works in this. Called Jared. He was on his way to meet a private investigator. They jumped on the case, helped us with it. But that was when the light bulb went off with me with what he was trying to do. He's like, oh, well, this girl's up in Ohio. We're all going to have to go up there to get her. We're going to have to bring her. That's a long drive from Nashville. Yeah. So I kind of could see what he was trying to do. So I went to him. I'm like, well, I think you could use volunteer pilots to do this. I think his mind was more towards charter or something. But, I'm like, all right, we can do this. I said, I'll be the pilot. Let's just try it with this group you're working with. And I'll fly. If you guys need someone to fly, I will fly. So I went through the process to become a volunteer with Rescue One Global with one other pilot friend of mine who is well connected with Angel Flight. Because at the beginning, to be quite honest, I thought Angel Flight would just do this. Silly me. We went down and met with Janine, who's in Georgia, and she was wonderful. I thought they would just take on these flights, but turns out it's not in their wheelhouse of what they do, and it would just be too much for them to take on. Okay. But on the plus side, they gave us everything on how to start it, how to run it, what we needed to do. And without that information, it would have taken us a lot longer to get started. It's like whatever you need, any piece of paperwork, anything, you want to see our systems and how we run things. And that was really, really helpful to us in starting. But that still left us with no pilots, no organization, And so we had done a few flights for Rescue One Global. I think we did 2 in 2 years. And I'm like, well, I guess they don't need us very much because they've only called me twice in 2 years. And on our second flight, we always take an advocate, and I'm flying back with the advocate. And I'm like, so you guys must not really need us. And she's like, oh, they've needed you all the time. They just don't call. I'm like, well, why aren't they calling me? That doesn't make sense. And she's like, well, they're worried that if they call you this time, then you won't be there the next time.
So they're like saving you for the really big ones? Is that the idea?
Right. Like, but this is a precious resource. We can't overuse it. If we use her this time, what if we really need her next time? So I said to the advocate, I'm like, yeah, there's a scarcity mindset in this community because they don't have the resources they need.
Sure.
And they looked at me as like scarcity. Like, oh, she said she's going to show up, but is she really? And so I told the advocate, I said, you go back there and you tell them to call me every single time. And she's like, okay. And so they kind of came back and said, yeah, well, we'll probably use you maybe 5 times a year. Well, given they'd used me twice in 2 years, that seems about right. And we wanted to be open to other groups in the Nashville area. So when we were getting some feedback from pilots, they wanted to do this because, I'd been talking to people about it. And I go, oh, yeah, we do those flights. So we filed our nonprofit paperwork. And this is interesting. So Jared filed that for us because he was a CEO of Rescue One. So he kind of knew how to do this stuff.
Yeah.
And he's like, it's going to take 6 months for this paperwork to go through. We got it back in 2 weeks.
No kidding.
It was no kidding. It was
There's
something
something fast-tracked it or what?
No, we just got it back in 2 weeks. And we thought it was fake. We thought this has got to be junk mail. It wasn't. It was real. And I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. So we're ready to go. And about that time, they told us they'd use us 5 times. We had this paperwork back that we're not expecting for 6 months.
Yeah, right.
And that was just a godsend because they called me, I think, 15 times in the next 3 months.
Wow.
And what we found is because we took this resource and that we took a burden off of them from having to transport people, from having to use their own resources, money, or whatever, that they were actually able to help more people in this situation. If they got a call from Ohio, they were more able to say, yeah, we can help you versus, no, look for someone in your area. Okay. And it just seemed to be more helpful to them. And then they were able to expand their services at that time or opening it up to the other services here in Middle Tennessee. I was pilfering from my students to do some of these flights and getting other people signed up for it. And, so in Nashville, we probably had the most pilots of any place just because it's where we started. But word of mouth was starting to spread quickly. And I go to, and this is just a few months later, I'm going to GoJet. So now I can't do any of the flights. I'm somewhere else. And I remember the first day I did IOE, which if you don't know what that is, that's your first day in the jet. Mm-hmm. We were supposed to get an article in AOPA. I know Amanda Farnsworth, and she's like, yeah, we're going to get this article in there. Okay, but the article never went. They never told us when it was going to go, and we're like, oh, they forgot about it. They dropped the ball. Okay, it printed, and then they didn't tell it. And it went to online. Okay. So I get back from IOE, and I had 500 emails.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like,
where do we start?
What are we going to do? He's like, Stephanie, I got a system. Everyone's getting a response. We're going to do this. And when you get home, we're going to do a phone call day. And we're calling all these pilots. And I remember calling one pilot out in Oregon, of all places. And I'm like, this is Stephanie Lamar, da, 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 da. And he's like, Stephanie Lamar? You're calling me? I'm like, yeah. So, but you're the founder. You're calling me. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's just me. And he's like, no, it's not just you anymore. You are surrounded by the pilot community. And we're here to help you. And that just hit me like
awesome.
Just what I needed to hear because it feels lonely when you start something like this. And there were 2 of us, thankfully, but it's a lot of work.
Sure.
I mean, it's the paperwork. It's the accounting, it's the getting a website up and all the little things that go into it that you don't see. And then I'm having to do all the flight coordination. So when we got a call, I couldn't do it. I'd have to find a pilot, and get it done. And every flight that we did took about 6 to 8 hours of coordination. And so I'm trying to do that while I'm a commercial pilot. And I remember sitting up and on reserve, and I'm in this apartment that I was renting, just feeling like I'm on house arrest. And I get this call for this flight to be done in North Carolina. And at that time, I had 4 pilots in North Carolina. So I send the flight request to them, and it was to move a minor. She wanted to go with her law enforcement officer that she was very close to, and then we needed to send a female advocate along. So that's a full plane, right? Yeah. And I wasn't sure if anyone would be able to do it, but I sent it out, and one of the pilots wrote me back and said, I can't do this, but I'm going to ask my friend if he can do it. I start getting this paperwork from who I'm assuming is the friend, and he hasn't even said if he could do it. And so I call up this guy, and he's like, yeah, I'll do it. I got a bear, and no big deal. I'm like, all right. And, you're trying to figure out all this coordination, and because they were minors, you got paperwork. So I'm like, well, they want to do it Tuesday. No, it's Wednesday. No, it's Tuesday, because I have to get this paperwork done. They need to move them as quickly as possible. And he's just like, whichever day, just let me know. And then the group, the organization called me, and they're like, we've got another minor who's willing to leave. Will you take this one too? And I'm thinking, well, we're going to have to do 2 flights or something. And I called him up because he said he had a bairn, but I didn't know if it was the baby bairn or the one with 6. I didn't know. Yep. And I'm like, can you take one more? He's like, let me call you back. He's like, okay, that means no. And he called me back and he goes, do you mind if I take a friend of mine with me and we rent a King Air? I'm like, I don't mind at all. If this is what you want to do, you just go right ahead and rent that King Air. They had such a great time. They sent us the pictures with the girls and everything, and they're like, when can we do this again? Yeah. And that one just hit my heart because it was so early on, and just a little bit like, am I going to be able to make this work with the very few pilots that we have and the number of calls that were coming in? And that just gave me hope that these pilots are serious about getting this done. They're serious about what we're trying to do, and they're going to recruit. They're going to help. And it really does feel like a community in aviation that, people care about others, and we're going to get this done. And so that's been very encouraging. I mean, we've just seen one miracle after another since we started this. Yeah. From the paperwork in 2 weeks, because without that, you can't get pilots. They would probably do it, but they don't get their tax deductions and things like that. It's not official. And just getting everything off the ground, the support that we've had from Janine and Angel Flight and from AOPA just to even do that first article. And even from finances, like we'd have a check that would come in and then we'd have to purchase tickets or something. And it would just be always, I would get a pilot. This was always just a miracle to me. I get a pilot in some remote location. Oh, you probably don't need me here. It's not going on here. I'm like, oh, it's everywhere. And the next week I'd have to call that one pilot. Is like, you're the only pilot I have in this area, and we have a flight now. Can you do it? And so it's just been amazing to see the pilots step up and get all this going. But this was not on my radar to start a business, really. Sure. Especially at the same time I'm going to the airline. But, God puts you where he wants you when he gets you. It's been interesting. So we have flown or just did our 200th flight.
Good for you.
And that is in 2 years. So our first year we thought we'd do 15 to 20 flights. So we did 100.
Yeah.
So it is kind of spinning up fast. Department of Homeland Security found us pretty fast. So we were their partners with them, and they were kind of excited about what we're doing because we're actually helping people and not just like teaching people.
Right.
About.
I think that people don't necessarily understand all that DHS does. It's not just, the TSA people at the airport. They've got a pretty robust investigative side as well.
They really do. And they're trying to teach people what's going on. I don't think a lot of people know that human trafficking is the number 2 industry in this country. The number 1 industry is drugs. And this one, they say in a few years, it's going to surpass drugs.
Wow.
And so people, they know what's going on, but from what they know, it's like the movies, I get a lot of questions from pilots. And so there's the education there. They either think they're all foreign nationals. No, most of them are American citizens. Who are you transporting? We end up transporting a lot of women, but the truth of it is half the humans trafficking survivors are men. The reason we are mostly moving women are because we are working with nonprofits. So we're working with the shelters. Well, the grant money is going to help women in shelters. There isn't grant money to start a men's shelter. So they're trying to change that now. So we might do some changes that in the next few years. But that's just the reality of the situation. And it's just going on in so many places. In fact, we did a video, which we'll be posting soon, from one of our very first flights that we did. And that woman is telling her story. And it's now been 2 years later and her recovery and what the flight meant to her. So what we're hearing from the nonprofits is that now that the girls know there's a plane ready to take them and waiting, they are more likely to leave their situation. So maybe before about half would leave, now we're looking at 90%. Okay. Not only that, when they get in the plane, I think psychologically there's a lift there. It's like, oh, I felt safe for the first time. He can't touch me here. He doesn't know where I'm going. And so it's really a freeing experience. And so I find it interesting that maybe in the coming years, we'll see how it really has affected them mentally as well as just getting them out of those situations.
Sure. So that leads me to a question of what types of flights are you doing? What kind of situations are you guys being called for? Is it just shelter relocation or are there other things?
Yeah, so that's one of them. Basically, half of our flights are getting someone out of an immediate situation to a shelter location. So if someone gets picked up by law enforcement or they're in a hospital or they call the hotline, however they choose to kind of get out of this situation, they're usually going to be put in contact with some sort of nonprofit agency. Okay. And that agency would be the one that would call us. So let's say I'm in the Nashville area and they were in the hospital and they decide, oh, this is a trafficking survivor. We've called it a nonprofit. They don't necessarily want them to do the restorative care in Nashville. This is the backyard of where they are. They'll always be looking over their shoulder. So they're going to want to get them to another shelter location. So that's where we come in. Okay. And it's like, all right, we'll help you get them there. And so we always take the advocate with us. So the pilot's never alone with the survivor. And we'll move them to that location. That's about half of our flights. And thankfully to the pilot community, they have been very responsive because if we get 3 days notice, we're doing good. A lot of same day, 2 days, so.
I think this is really interesting, the advocacy part of it, that it's not just the pilot and the survivor. You have an advocate who's there with them, likely probably answering a lot of questions about resources and what next steps that the pilot may not have the answers to. So,
yeah, and also we didn't want the pilots to ever feel like they were responsible for a survivor or also feel like they're putting themselves at risk.
Yeah, I see that.
I don't want to be responsible for this person. What if we get where we're going and there's no one there to pick them up or, we don't know. And they've been traumatized. So some of our clients, they don't want to talk to the pilot or they might be afraid of this pilot. A lot of them, it's the first time they've been treated like a human though, and they have enjoyed the experience. We call them VIPs in our little sphere just because this is our passenger and they are getting a private flight. So we're going to treat them like a VIP. We're going to make sure that they're well cared for and everything is to a high standard, and we're making sure that every little detail is done from the moment they get there till they get dropped off and picked up at the other location. We also want our advocates there in case there's any sort of risk. We were part of an operation where they were picking up a woman, and they're getting her out that day. There was law enforcement involved in doing that, and our flight was going to be there, so they were going to bring her right to the airport, and then she's going to fly to a safe location. Well, in these situations, people can be taking drugs or whatever, and I think the altitude in the aircraft, she ended up having an overdose on board.
Oh, no.
So now you got this going on in the back of the airplane, but you got the advocate there giving Narcan, doing all the things she needs to do. But the pilot, and we called a very particular pilot to do this one, he had done several flights and ex-military and stuff, so we thought, okay, he can handle the stress of it. So we knew it would be a little more stressful than our typical flight, although we weren't expecting the overdose, but, just the situation in general. And so he was getting ready to do an emergency landing. I mean, right? You got to get her medical care or do things like that. Well, she ate him too, threw up or whatever you do with the Narcan and the drugs out of her system. And she's like, they're ready. Like, they're coming in to a new airport. And she's like, where are we? They told her where she was. And she's like, we are not far enough. You have to keep going. And that just struck me. I'm just like, I can't imagine dying. Really, that's an overdose. You're dying. You come to, and now your fear is I'm not far enough away from this, whatever was going on. Like you're obviously further, and surrounded by people who are trying to help you. So that just, I don't know, for some reason that always just struck me, that the fear involved in all this.
Yeah, I think it's really hard for most people to wrap their heads around what that fear is for some people. So, but the fact that there's people out there as advocates and pilots working in this program, I think is really great. And folks like you who put this together in the first place, I mean, that's so commendable.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're doing well. We hired a flight coordinator, thank the Lord, because like I said, Jared and I, between the two of us, we were like, we could handle 4 to 6 flight requests a month. But like, that's about it because of the number of hours it took to coordinate. And we were blessed with some finances that allowed us to hire a flight coordinator. And that has just taken a load off because we started getting 4 to 6 requests a week. I mean, I'd be in between flights at GoJet trying to figure, okay, I'll take this up. Okay, well, I got to fly. I can't answer.
Right.
It's just difficult. And so I'd be home for 4 days and I'd be dealing with all this stuff and then going to work and then no time off. And which is, it's fine. I'm glad we did all this, but glad to have a flight coordinator. So that's been a little bit of a relief one.
So let's talk briefly about, there's pilots that are listening to this and they're like, you know what, this is something I want to get involved in. What kind of things are you looking for in your pilots and like, what are the requirements?
So the only real requirement is, of course, you need to be a private pilot at least and have 250 hours of flight time. We do not require an instrument rating. One, because we are nationwide and a lot of people out west don't necessarily get it anyway because of their weather. And also we can't keep track of when people are current or not current. So that's really the only requirement. We do a phone call with the pilots, or they can get on a webinar that happens once a month. And we kind of talk through how it works, what's the process, when a flight does come up and what to expect, because, we want to go over some things, how do you interact with the survivor?
Yeah.
You are going to have an advocate. We like to let them know kind of how that process works so they know you're not just going to be alone with this individual, and how the flight requests come through, because we still send emails. We don't use like VPOIDs or anything. Okay. And how private it needs to be. We talked about that, like no pictures on social media, things like that. So we go over all that with them, and then they can fill out their paperwork and they get signed up. So interesting with us, if there's not a flight in your area, you may not think much is going on, so we try to send out a newsletter and let people know what's going on. But yeah, and they can go to our website at freedomaviationnetwork.org and check us out there. There's links there to get signed up, and
I will 100% have the link to that in our show notes. And when you guys have that video ready, let me know. I'll post that all over the place too.
Yeah. I think Jared was going to send it out soon, so my husband filmed that. And it was just an amazing story.
Oh, that's right. He works in doing that kind of thing. I forgot about that.
Yeah. So he filmed it, which was nice because she said she wanted to tell her story. And I was like, I don't want her to tell her story for the first time at our event that had like 250 people. They said, let's film it, and then she'll have it if she wants to use it for other speaking engagements or whatever she wanted to use it for. And so, we made her feel like a star. I hope so, because we had gifts for her and she got to do hair and makeup and all this stuff. So that was kind of fun. But, we have a video that we can share with people and they can really hear her story, because what's interesting about her story, especially for people in Middle Tennessee, is she was trafficked in Murfreesboro and she's an American citizen. So how does that happen? And you'll kind of hear a little bit about her story and how she got into this. And for her, not even realizing she was being trafficked for a large part of that, and how she got out of it. what the flight meant to her and how she is doing now. And so I think it's just a powerful piece for people to hear a real story. And maybe that's not a movie Hollywood version of what's going on, you know.
No, this is heavy stuff. So, I mean, for someone to put themselves out there like that and tell their story and share it, so it kind of opens eyes for others, I think is so great that she's able to have the courage to do that.
Her words were, if God gets me out of this situation, I'm going to make sure I tell everyone so that they can be helped, if I can do anything to help others. Because raising awareness, I found, is half of our battle. A lot of people don't think it's really going on in their area, or, well, I know it's something that's happening at the border in New York. Or, you know, they don't think that everyone in their little community, or I live in a wealthier community, so it's not my, you know, like, it's all these kind of prejudice that we make up in our mind. And I didn't know anything about this until I got involved in it. You know, I certainly didn't realize it was as big as it is. Like I told you, I mean, when they told us they do 5 flights a year, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. There's not that much going on. There can't be that many flights. And then for us to do 100 in that first year was shocking to me. You know, so it's not like I'm an expert, becoming more so, but, you know, for me, it was always, if someone just needs a flight, if that's what it's going to be, you know, they just need a ride to get out of this situation. That's the least I can do.
Yeah. So. I think that part of the awareness piece too is I don't think people want to acknowledge some of the things that happen in their own backyard, or maybe they're naive to it. It's just like, well,
I think it's naive because we have people on our board that we've had to educate, and, you know, they're like, well, I live in this wealthy community, you know, I'm a businessman, and Jared, who's my partner, he's like, oh, I could go in your neighborhood and show you which houses, you know, like, we don't realize what's going on. And we'll go to this coalition with the Murfreesboro Police Department and all these other groups that meet up, and they're telling us what a problem it is and how much it's becoming more of a problem with domestic servitude and the children that are being shipped here, and, you know, all this online stuff, you know, teenagers that run away and because they're offered something online, whether it be, oh, if you send me your headshot, I'll get you this modeling job. You just have to meet me over here. Well, I mean, even grown-ups are susceptible to those kinds of things. So, of course, kids are, and it's just unfortunate. But that's part of why we do what we do. Runaway teens, they might have gotten trafficked out of the bus station or out of those kinds of places. And so the answer, and this is part of why we do what we do, how these organizations have been running before, they're doing everything they can. But a lot of times they would just give someone a bus ticket and hope they make it to the other location. And that's just, I'm not putting down that effort, but that's just all the resource they had.
Sure.
And so it's nice to be able to be helpful in that way. And not only to give them a ride, but to elevate it.
Yeah.
Like, you know what? You're being treated like a queen today.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
You know, so it's a lot of fun. One of my first flights, I'll tell you this was just so funny. So this was like our first flight we were doing. We're taking someone somewhere, well, let's say. But she kept asking me, when are we going to be there? When are we going to go down? And I'd show her for a flight, you know, and they're like, here we are, not for a while, not for a while. And I must have answered this question like 5 times. So finally, I just decided to ask her, why do you keep asking me when we're going to be there? She's like, because I want to go through a cloud. Well, there were some fluffy little clouds below us, but we were starting to get to an area where there weren't very many. And I'm like,
I gotcha.
Said to my pilot friend who was next to me, like, I think we need to divert for buildups. So I'm sure that controller's like, who are these idiots? Like, can we descend 2,000 feet? Oh, okay. Can we go way over here? We're diverting for buildups. Oh, sure.
Yeah, sure.
And we finally made it through a cloud. She just loved it. So it was
so great.
Kind of funny, but that was fun.
This has been so great and really eye-opening, and I cannot thank you enough for your time to not just tell your story about kind of moving back into aviation, but the great things that you guys are doing. So keep up the awesome.
Thank you for having us, and we appreciate it.
Stephanie, again, I can't thank you enough for your time and really appreciate you coming on the Fly the Transition podcast. And if people are trying to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
They could go to our website at freedomaviationnetwork.org, and from there they can just click on the link and reach out to us.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much again.
All right, thank you.
Well, certainly a compelling interview with Stephanie, and I really appreciate her taking the time to come on this episode of Fly the Transition. Really, the concept for this episode came out as I was looking at solo episode ideas on ways that people could gain hours through volunteer flying. And as I did that, I stumbled upon Freedom Aviation Network. And not only that, but seeing Stephanie's story as someone who had ultimately transitioned not just into an aviation career, but has been a huge part of building such a great program that has such a great cause. The survivors of human trafficking, sexual and domestic violence are kind of a near and dear concept to me. And to see that there's an organization out here like that is working with these survivors to get them the support they need to help them get out of bad situations is certainly really inspiring to me. So, truth be told, I've filled out all my forms online to show my interest in being a bit more of an active participant with Freedom Aviation Network as well. So if nothing else, if we can help spread the word about this organization through this episode, fantastic. I also hope to feature Freedom Aviation Network again on the Flying Midwest podcast, as Stephanie helps me find a Midwest region pilot who is actively working on these missions as well. So stay tuned for news on that if you found this episode to be interesting. I'll get the word out on when that episode is available as that develops. Well, a bit of a longer episode, but I think totally worth it. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. And again, if you like what I'm doing, please like, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you're listening to this. And if you're interested in being a guest on a future episode, certainly send me an email, flythetransition@gmail.com, to be considered for a future episode. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode of Fly the Transition. And until next time, keep your eyes on the skies and your dreams soaring high.
You've been listening to Fly the Transition. Life is too short for you not to do what you love. And our passion is to give you all the tools you need to make the transition from doing what you do to being in the aviation industry. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, you can reach out by email at flythetransition@gmail.com. Find us on Facebook at Fly the Transition. And the website for Flying Midwest Media is flyingmidwest.com. Keep soaring. See you next time on Fly the Transition.